So there are certain players on your team that right now you might love them, but I'm here to tell you, you have to trade them away. Now, don't get me wrong. They've been producing for you. That's why you're enjoying them, but that's not going to continue. And the reasoning is different for each of these guys. So let's start with a player in Detroit. And that'll be the rookie Jahmyr Gibbs, who had his best game of the season and thus his career in week 7. With David Montgomery out, Gibbs saw elite usage. 86% of the snaps. That's a rare number for running backs in today's NFL. And 79% of the rush attempts. I mean, basically the only guys who are seeing this type of usage are like Christian McCaffrey, maybe Josh Jacobs, and Kyren Williams when he was healthy. Now, this totaled a really solid game for Jahmyr Gibbs. 20 total touches on 21 opportunities, goes over 120 total yards, gets his first touchdown. He benefited from the Detroit Lions playing from behind the entire game. They get blown out in this one, so it's a lot of passing, which led to a lot of targets for a great and elite receiving back in Gibbs. So this was the usage that you were hoping for from Gibbs. He ends up producing in a major way, and he sees all of the usage over the other running back in this backfield, Craig Reynolds. Now, in 2 games with David Montgomery out this season, missing with injury, we've seen Gibbs play 75% of the snaps and average 19 touches per game. But that's exactly the issue. He's only seen this solid to strong usage when Montgomery has been out. And as you can see from the tweet right here, a doctor on Twitter, Jeff Mueller, David Montgomery is expected to miss some time. He's already missed 1 game, but it's not a major injury. Cam Akers dealt with this injury in 2020, only missed 2 games. The Lions do have a week 9 bye, so maybe they just hold Montgomery out for their Monday Night Football game this week, but there's also a chance Montgomery could return this week. So it's sort of a risk if you have Jahmyr Gibbs. You might get another start out of him heading into the bye, but you might get him going back to his usage when Montgomery was healthy, where he doesn't see a lot of production, which makes right now maybe the best time to sell him after a top 3 running back finish in week 7. But you can see the matchup for him is going to be good if you wanted to take that gamble for 1 more week and keep him on your rosters. 8-point favorites against a Raiders bottom 10 tackling unit at home on Monday Night Football. It could be pretty dang good, and if he goes off, it was in prime time, everybody saw it, maybe even more trade value heading into week 9 bye. Now, personally, I believe this is the highest value you'll get for Jahmyr Gibbs this season, and you can pitch his week 8 matchup as a positive thing, an 8-point favorite for whoever you're trading him to, even though it might be his last big start. I would target guys like Kyren Williams if your team is in a position to do so, since he's going to miss some games, or even Ramondre Stevenson in trades for Gibbs. All right, now let's talk about Deontay Foreman, who was just the highest scoring running back. Gibbs was number 3 this past week. Foreman was the number 1 scoring running back in week 7. And now this is something this guy has done in multiple places now. Be the highest scorer on the week, have top 5 finishes. He did it with his time with the Titans. He did it last year with the Panthers in a 3-touchdown game, and he did it with a 3-touchdown game this past week. And he was involved everywhere. In the receiving department, has a couple of catches, 31 yards and a touchdown. On the ground, has 89 rushing yards, somewhat efficient there, and has multiple touchdowns. There's no other way to say this other than Foreman has fully taken advantage of the other injuries in his backfield. Khalil Herbert remains on IR and will miss some more time. And then there's Rashad Johnson, the rookie who's dealing with a concussion, is going on now 2.5 weeks out, but he's expected to return soon. And let's remember that Rashad Johnson beat out Deontay Foreman in the preseason for the RB2 job, and there was even some murmurs that Foreman could be cut. I mean, here's the exact snap shares even from this season. Deontay Foreman, there's no numbers by his name for week 2, 3, 4, and 5 because he was inactive. Meanwhile, Rashad Johnson was playing, and in some of these weeks was playing just as many snaps like in week 1 and week 3 as Khalil Herbert. But as I mentioned, Rashad has been dealing with a more complicated concussion. But we did receive some good news from his head coach, Matt Eberflus, who said he only has 1 more hurdle to clear and that he's likely to practice on Wednesday. Maybe you're watching this on Wednesday. Depending on when you are watching this, we might already have that news. That's great news for Rashad. And it's even better news because it's the perfect timing and really matchup and game script for him. He's going to be an 8.5-point road underdog against the bottom 5 Chargers run defense. A lot of the times this season, even when Khalil Herbert was healthy, we saw Rashad Johnson playing in obvious passing down situations, which as 8.5-point underdogs on the road seems like a situation we see a lot of Rashad snaps. And if indeed Rashad suits up week 8 and he sees some usage, it will pull directly from Deontay Foreman, who's coming off of the potentially best week that he'll have for the rest of his career. So I'd look to sell Deontay Foreman for somebody reasonable, like Kareem Hunt, who should be a starter for the next couple weeks with Jerome Ford hurt, or Gus Edwards, who's the starter on his team. They're not sexy names, but Deontay Foreman can go right back to being the RB3 in a week or two. Now, the next man up, we go to Tampa Bay, Rashad White, the second-year player. Look, we had some concerns last week. He was basically splitting the carries with Keyshawn Vaughn, his backup, but all of that changed this past game because Rashad White went out there and he saw 78% of the snaps. Now, he's always been seeing the snaps, even in last week's game when he didn't get as many carries because he saw the passing game work while they trailed, but 68% of the rush attempts, season-high usage on the ground after seeing a season-low usage last week. So this is all good news, and it proves that last week was probably just a little bit of a blimp on the radar, or if anything, they didn't really like what they saw from Keyshawn Vaughn, but there's still some concerns with White. Despite producing in the air on his 6 targets, 65 yards, we like to see that. It gives him a floor and even a ceiling. He just still was inefficient on the ground. 13 carries for 34 yards. That's 2.6 yards per carry, and now through 23 career games in the NFL, he has really not shown to be efficient in any of these games on the ground. And that has continued if you just look at the splits for this season, where he ranks 5th 52nd, averaging barely over 3 yards per carry this season. And then you look at his yards per touch, which factors in his receiving ability, probably his best overall trait, just 42nd amongst running backs, 4.1 yards per touch. This is not strong efficiency. And we've seen other backs as recent as last week or a week before that start to lose snaps because of their inefficiencies. Just look at Dameon Pierce in Houston. Devin Singletary saw more snaps, touches, overall opportunities before the bye week than him because Pierce had been inefficient. Now look, White doesn't really have any competition. Keyshawn Vaughn has been basically inefficient his entire career. Sean Tucker, an undrafted free agent, he dropped in the draft due to some medical concerns, so there's not as much of a chance that like a Devin Singletary, a veteran, steals touches, but if he continues to just average 2 to 3 yards per carry, they're going to give other guys snaps like they did last week with Vaughn. So I'm just looking to trade Rashad White for somebody who seems like they have more upside and we've actually seen more boom weeks out of them, like a Nico Collins or heck, even a Garrett Wilson coming off the bye week. Now we got to talk about another running back who flashed out of nowhere in week 7, but before we do that, make sure you hit the subscribe button on this video. 67% of people who watch the videos aren't subscribed, and a lot of people just don't know it. It takes 2 seconds, helps you see my future videos, and also helps the channel grow. Oh yeah, and one more thing on that Rashad White stuff. He has some tough matchups coming up. Maybe not next week against Buffalo, although they are on the road, but matchups against the Titans and 49ers as you try to inch closer to the fantasy playoffs, those are scary. Now we get to that running back who popped up out of nowhere, and it was because he wasn't with a team. He wasn't on an active roster since midway through last year, and it's Daryl Henderson of the Rams who was the clear starter this past week. Right as the game started, we got to see him on the field first with the offense, meaning he was the starter in this game. And he did command start usage. It wasn't elite usage, but he still saw a majority of the snaps, 58%, and 60% of the rush attempts. Overall, this led to a 19-touch game. He came off of the couch, literally wasn't with an NFL team or on a practice squad or anything. 19 touches is solid. He now has 15 or more touches in 16 games with the Rams these past 3 years. Now, the story for Daryl Henderson is nice, and Sean McVay clearly trusts him, but as always with him in his career, he just hasn't been efficient. 66 yards on 19 total touches. That's just 3.5 yards per touch, and he did not see any type of elite role here. Because yes, the role was nice, but we still saw another running back in Royce Freeman who was signed from the practice squad and has been on the active roster. We just saw that this guy played 42% of the snaps, saw 40% of the rush attempts, was close to a 50-50 split. It was Henderson who got the touchdown, so he had more fantasy points, but Freeman was also seeing red zone and goal line snaps in this game. So this backfield should be pretty close to split the next month. Myles Gaskin's expected to be active in week 8, but once Kyren Williams return, these guys will become irrelevant again. But based on week 7 and the fantasy points he scored because of the touchdown, there's a chance your league mates actually view Henderson better than this, better than just a replacement for a few weeks in a split backfield. And if that's the case, you should try and trade him as soon as possible for a more stable piece that you know will be involved in the fantasy playoffs, like probably a Tyler Lockett or a Rashee Rice for the Kansas City Chiefs, their rookie receiver. All right, now let's discuss a wide receiver who's been in this video a couple of times, and he just continues to produce and slap me in the face. And that'll be Courtland Sutton, who just had another strong game in week 7, but still, all of the underlying usage is saying this guy is overproducing, kind of like Clyde Edwards-Helaire for the first month to 5 weeks of the year last year, surviving off of touchdowns. Now, if you haven't listened to me, or maybe you haven't seen the videos until now, well, you only got more and more value or more and more trade bait out of Courtland Sutton because he put up a 20-point game here, caught all 6 of his targets, had a touchdown, did most of his damage in the first half, a great diving catch, and then the Broncos got up and they only threw 29 total times in this game. And now on the season, Sutton's a top 24 receiver, which helps us. We liked him in the preseason part of this, but the overall offense doesn't look all that great. And check this out. Even though he's 23rd in fantasy points, he ranks 49th, as you can see right here on Pro Football Focus, is in expected fantasy points. So based on his usage, he's expected to only score 10.7 points per game. That's 22% fewer than he's actually scored. Now you might be saying, well, what does that all mean? Basically, it just means he's been getting lucky based on his usage, and it comes down to his touchdowns. Because Sutton only ranks 31st in targets this season, 6.2 per game. Wide receivers with similar usage this year rank around the wide receiver 40 in fantasy production, but Sutton's top 24 because he already has 5 touchdowns. But check this out right here. His 5 touchdowns, this 16% next to it, according to Player Profiler, that is his touchdown rate. How often he's scoring a touchdown on his receptions, and he's scoring a touchdown on 11% of his targets. That's 2 to 3 times more than the NFL average rate. Clearly, this is going to be coming down. So in my opinion, you should sell Sutton when he's at his peak because of all this touchdown luck for somebody who's more sustainable and actually earns more targets in an offense that throws more in the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now let's talk about Josh Palmer, who in previous weeks we were saying you need to add this guy, and then Mike Williams gets hurt and we're like, yeah, now you definitely need to add him. And now quickly he's becoming one of the better wide receiver adds of the entire season after he exploded in week 7. He goes for 133 yards on 7 targets, and he averaged over 26 yards per catch catch the most of anybody in week 7 who had at least 4 receptions. He was a massive part of this game, and he just missed another couple of big plays. Barely tackled on a big play that would have been a touchdown after that, and just missed on a really difficult catch for another 30 to 40 plus yard gain. Now, I know what you're saying. Well, why would we be trading this guy? I'm actually here to tell you don't. I've been seeing a lot of people ask me questions. Who should I sell him? Who should I sell high for? Josh Palmer? I'm saying no. Hold Josh Palmer. Because he's been great, and he's easily holding off the first-round wide receiver this entire preseason and this season since Mike Williams has gotten hurt. You can see Adam Levitan's tweet right here. Since Mike Williams has gotten hurt, he's earned 22 targets. Josh Palmer, Quentin Johnson, just 7. 270 yards for Palmer, just 38 for Quentin Johnson, the first-round pick out of TCU. And things should only continue for Palmer, who continues to run basically every route out there, has now outproduced in terms of targets earned Keenan Allen in 2 of their last 3 games together, and he's going to get the Bears a bottom 10 secondary next at home as an 8.5-point favorite with a really nice team total. The way Justin Herbert's playing, you could probably expect another 7 or 8 targets for Palmer here. But it's not just this next matchup that's encouraging and the reason why I want you to hold him. Here's the main reason why I think he's a hold. Outside of his recent production, look at his matchups heading into and in the fantasy playoffs. He gets the Broncos right before the fantasy playoffs, then the Raiders, a bottom 10 defense, then the Bills, who continue to struggle due to some injuries to their cornerback core and their linebackers. So that's actually a plus matchup at home. And then in the fantasy championship, the Broncos, again, the worst defense in the NFL. This is fantastic. And now without Mike Williams in his career, Palmer averages 13 fantasy points on 8 targets per game. This Chargers team is throwing at a top 10 rate, and Herbert looks fine enough to sustain his fantasy weapons. I'm not trading Josh Palmer. If anything, I'm trading for him. Now, the next man up here is Brian Robinson, who had a strong start to the season. He had nice games against teams like the Denver Broncos, a terrible offense, but since then, we just haven't seen it from him. The Commanders have gotten down in some games, and we've seen Antonio Gibson take over, and then these last couple of games, we're seeing more out of the rookie late-round pick, Chris Rodriguez. Yes, you might not know the name Chris Rodriguez, but he saw 39% of the rush attempts this past week in week 7. That was just 1 fewer than Brian Robinson. Splitting the carries with Brian Robinson, a guy who's not involved in the passing game, that's a major red alert concern for Brian Robinson fantasy owners. Now, 39% of the carries and 7 overall carries isn't going to make Chris Rodriguez a flashy waiver ad unless you're in super deep leagues. He's somebody to at least take notice of. But these 7 carries, these 31 yards led the team in rushing this past week. And Antonio Gibson remains involved. He's not a fantasy option by any means, but over the last 4 weeks of the season, he has seen over 45% of the snaps, right in line with Brian Robinson, because he's seeing the passing down work when the Commanders fall behind, which has been a lot of the time because they're taking tons of sacks and their defense has not been able to hold any big athletic wide receivers or tight ends down. So now Brian Robinson's role hasn't been all that great. If you look at him over the last 5 weeks, he's only played 46% of the snaps. This is a split backfield, now becoming a 3-headed backfield on not one of the greatest offenses, and he doesn't have passing down work. He's only seen 11 opportunities per game the past month, and he's been averaging less than 10 fantasy points during that time, but he keeps finding the end zone, so he's just getting you there to make his totals look decent. And that still gives him some trade value, which is good for you if you own him, because these touchdowns won't continue, especially if Chris Rodriguez starts to get involved more. And the schedule is not good for Brian Robinson. At home against the Eagles is a brutal matchup. Against the Patriots, run defense isn't great. The Seahawks have a good run defense. You scroll down a little bit more and you get matchups against the Cowboys. 4 of his next 5 games are not beneficial spots. So I'm looking to deal Brian Robinson. Heck, if you can get like top end value, I would consider somebody like Kyren Williams top end value. Won't play for the next month, but if your team's in a good spot, might as well just stash him for the fantasy playoffs. And now, speaking of the fantasy playoffs, the fantasy blueprint will help you get there. Over 4,000 people are currently using it because if you want to make your fantasy playoffs smack around your competition for every single matchup, this will help you. Every day of the week, I send you a key tool that I create in my databases, waiver wire tiers, rest of season rankings, projections or rankings, game-by-game matchup notes, even more, all updated to help you win. But there's an added wrinkle. Whether you already have the blueprint or don't, this is going to be very interesting to you. To get the blueprint, it's simply just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below. Our partner for the fantasy blueprint is Vivid Picks, and they're doing a giveaway for this week only. If anybody deposits $10, whether you already have a Vivid Picks account or not, $10 using the code SAL, you'll get the fantasy blueprint if you don't already, and also will be entered to win 2 NFL tickets to any game of your choosing. You can check it out. You can read the rules right here. Just $10 cash entry sometime before the week 8 games begin. Now, these are the 2 simple steps you'll follow when you scan the QR code or click the link in the description. And if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, I'll just refund. It's only $5, by the way, this blueprint for the rest of the season, not just for the week, but I'll refund it. This is 100% risk-free. Might as well take advantage of it, and also redeposit that $10 if you already have the blueprint, because then you get entered into a chance to win 2 tickets for you and whoever else you want to any NFL game of your choice. So to join the thousands of other people currently using the blueprint and get into that giveaway raffle for this week, scan the QR code on the screen or click that link in the description below. Now, the next man up is Darren Waller, and I have to talk about Darren Waller because I actually just acquired him in one of my leagues, which means I don't think he's a trade away. He is, just like Josh Palmer, a hold. Do not trade this man. If anything, try and trade for him, because it's been a brutal year for Darren Waller, but pretty quietly over the last month, he's back to being elite, and this was topped off by his best performance of the season against the Washington Commanders, which he'll get to face again in a couple of weeks. 8 targets, goes for nearly 23 fantasy points, just misses a 100-yard bonus in some of those leagues, and finds the end zone. And coming off of that game, he's now been great for really like the last 5 or 6 weeks. Check this out. He's had 7 or more targets in 5 of his last 6 games and ranks 3rd now in tight end usage this season. So given his slow start, you might think he's been awful this year, but look at this. He's actually top 5 in tight end scoring, 11.3 points per game, despite only having 1 touchdown this year, playing with a backup quarterback the past 2 games who has been playing borderline better than Daniel Jones, if not better, and also playing without Andrew Thomas. If you're not familiar, Andrew Thomas is one of the best tackles in the NFL. He's been banged up for a lot of the games this year, which gives less time to throw the ball and even leaves Darren Waller having to chip block a lot more. Now, Waller has been having this success, a top 5 fantasy tight end, despite ranking 23rd in catchable passes amongst tight ends. 22% of his targets haven't been catchable. I expect these inaccurate targets to change once somebody like Andrew Thomas is back and he has more time, or at least his quarterback has more time to throw. So Waller is the clear #1 option in his offense that has been looking a little bit better, has a decent schedule coming up, and he's ran the most routes amongst all tight ends. That's solid usage. Everything is trending in the right direction for him. No, I am not selling high to the people who have asked me. If anything, I'm trying to buy him high. Now, a guy I'm not looking to buy high and I'm trying to trade away if the right deal presents itself, that is the important point here, is Adam Thielen, who has been a top 5 fantasy wide receiver this season, which is not something I ever thought I would be saying. And now Thielen will be exiting the buy, and you're hoping that this will help the offense, especially the rookie quarterback Bryce Young, as you usually see adjustments coming out of the bye week. But even in the games where Bryce Young has struggled, it's been Thielen still being good because he has a low average depth of target, meaning easy to complete passes for Young. But that also presents a potential downside for Thielen because he's only getting these targets underneath. He's not doing a lot after the catch. He's 33 years old, so he's not all that explosive anymore, but he's surviving on this. 59 targets through his 6 games. That is 9.8, basically 10 targets per game. What happens if the volume starts to drop? You have to ask yourself this question. Because as I mentioned, he's not being used downfield. Just 3 deep targets is 73rd amongst wide receivers and 7.8 average target distance. That ranks 82nd. He has the 82nd best role in the league in terms of where his targets are downfield. But don't get me wrong, he is still having a solid year because of all this volume. He's still top 24 in yards per route run, his efficiency, and his targets have been accurate because they're so short distance, 13th most accurate targets in the league from Bryce Young. But again, let me ask you a question. Do you think that this will continue for the rest of the season? That is an important question to ask. Because if you think the volume falls off, or if they actually start to throw downfield more, maybe to the rookie coming out of the bye week in Jonathan Mingo, or the roles evolve, or they acquire somebody at the trade deadline just to make Bryce Young's job easier. Well, if you think this happens, I think you have to try and at least throw some trades out there for Adam Thielen, because this is his absolute peak value as a top 3 fantasy option right now. Now, don't get me wrong. I think he'll finish as a top 25 receiver from this point forward, not counting the weeks before, but I don't think it's going to be top 10. So if you could trade him for a player who has shown success, but maybe hasn't been as flashy in terms of overall production, like say a Michael Pittman, I would be doing that. And I'd also still be taking trade offers for Derrick Henry because you have him coming off of a solid game. Now, he just was in the bye week, but the week before that had a solid fantasy performance of nearly 20 points and 100 total yards, and he clearly still has the name value. Look, Henry's been overall fine on the season, so this is kind of an easy guy to trade away. You just say, look, he's been a top 15 running back and hasn't even been himself, only has 3 touchdowns, whatever you want to say there, but you spent the 2nd round pick on him. You were hoping for him to be more than a top 15 running back. And there's really only been 1 game this season where he was the reason why you maybe won your week. 1 game out of 6, that's not typical for Henry. Now, that week was in week 4 against a bad Bengals run defense when the Bengals offense was struggling, so the Titans were in this game. I think Joe Burrow only had like 150 scoreless passing yards in that game, and you saw vintage Henry of 23 touches, over 100 yards and a touchdown. But on the season so far, we're seeing season low usage. 3.7 yards per carry is a career low, and his snaps are the lowest since 2018. You could see his season sample right here. On the season, just 56% of the snaps because the rookie running back Tajay Spears is being more involved, especially on passing downs, pulling directly away from the floor and ceiling of Derrick Henry. And that 3rd round pick in Tajay Spears, well, he's playing over 50% of the snaps in 5 out of 6 games. He's handling the majority of the passing down work, and we've seen explosive plays out of him in each of the last 2 games, like a 48-yard reception in week 6 when they were in London. Look, I don't really have a lot of bad things to say about Derrick Henry. I'm just hoping that you can improve your team, keep building the pieces upwards, trading to get a little bit of a better player. I think Henry will be a top 12 to 15 running back at the end of the year, but not a top 5 guy, not somebody who will win you your league. And after his 100+ yard performance in week 6, now's the time to try and trade him. Maybe you can get a Breece Hall who's also coming off of the bye. Maybe you can get a DeAndre Swift who continues to see more and more usage every single week. So these are the guys I would be looking to trade away. It doesn't mean they're bad players. Again, I just want you to have a better roster. Now, your next question might be, well, Sal, who do I trade them for? Well, I'm happy you asked, because this video right here breaks down the guys you should be targeting in trades before week 8. And just as a reminder, if you're one of the 67% of people who are not subscribed to the channel, again, a lot of people just don't know. It takes 2 seconds to check and subscribe. It lets you see all my future uploads more easily, and it helps me out a ton.